Hello, this is vlog, I believe, 6, and this is on chapter 2. And I believe that this is the last vlog because next week it should be the essay. So I have my notes over to the side and the camera's over here. But for the first portion of chapter 2, it starts off with the argument of being a poser. And so this chapter kind of talks about the subcultures of being a poser and how it could actually be a valuable part of discovering yourself and your own identity. And because people are so complex, there's no need to fit in a specific stereotype, and we're constantly evolving and exploring different interests, styles, communities, and it develops our personality. And so it's kind of explained as dabbling, and it exposes people to new experiences and different possibilities. And one of the things that I completely agree that we're constantly evolving and constantly kind of moving forward in what's interesting to us. There's kind of this quote where it talks about everyone's posing all the time. And I kind of disagree with this just because I think experimenting with identity doesn't necessarily mean that someone's pretending. I think people can change their interests, their presentation, while still being authentic to themselves. And I think that growth doesn't mean that you're constantly posing. I think it's just a different name of development. And I would rather say that we're constantly developing rather than we're constantly posing as something else, because I think posing kind of gives that narrative that we're trying to be someone that we're not. And even though we could be pushed towards a certain interest when we're stepping outside of our comfort zone, when it's something that we're not constantly being interested in a specific group and we're embracing outside of that box, I don't necessarily think that discovering this part of your identity is faking it. I think it's just exploring and developing. Moving on, the N word is flourishing among generational hip hop, and then it talks about specifically within the Hispanic Latino community. And so it talks about the growing use of the N word among like hip hop influenced Latinos, particularly Afro Latinos. And it kind of argues that it raises larger question about race, cultural identity, authenticity, and it's kind of created this complicated relationship between the Black and Latino community, and for those Afro Latinos that may feel kind of in the middle. And so it talks about the word and how it should not be treated as though it has become completely meaningless, which I 100% agree with. It because simply some people use it as very casual or a term of inclusion, maybe even endearment. And although that's okay for the people within that community, again, it kind of raises that larger question of, well, who really fits within that community? And on top of that, it kind of talks about the growing appreciation and recognition throughout the Afro-Latino community. And so even though this is a very complicated kind of subject on where does a person land, where they're allowed to use the word, where they're not, is it becoming too casual? Is it erasing the history behind the word? Positively, I think it's also allowed Latinos to embrace Blackness as well. And that section really emphasizes that, I feel. And a personal example, I myself am Hispanic, I'm Salvadorian. And so seeing personally how it affects specific groups of people, there's this kind of inside joke that has now been popularized more through TikTok, and it's within the Dominican population of people, of where you'll hear quite often Dominicans say, "Oh, I'm not black, I'm Dominican." "Oh, no, 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 I'm not black, I'm Dominican." And so now it's kind of become a joke where it's like, "Oh, no, 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 I'm not black, I'm Dominican." Um, but I think that kind of ties into this um, where something as being, you could be black and Dominican, right? But it's seen as something that's derogatory or negative. So even though you could very much be both, within the Hispanic community, being black and embracing blackness hasn't always been accepted. And so the N word kind of allowed people within the Latino community to embrace that a little bit more, especially if they're falling within the Afro Latino community. Very complicated, but I think it's super interesting. I think by far out of chapter 2, the segments that we read for this week, that one really was like, wow, to me. I think it kind of really made me take a look into my own community, even within the Salvadorian community. Yeah, and so I thought that was super fascinating. Moving on, the end of white America. So this kind of talks about how America is moving away from a society where whiteness defines cultural mainstream towards more multicultural and fluid society, in which identities may increasingly be shaped by culture. And it also kind of touches about how American culture has become increasingly influenced by many different racial and ethnic groups, especially because the discussion of like hip hop demonstrates how culture is rooted in Black American experiences. I think that kind of also talks about it's a very good flow between the portion of the chapter before where it's talking about the N word, and now we're talking about the end of white America. And so it kind of talks about how these Black American experiences become part of the mainstream without needing to be white first. You could be fully, authentically Black without need of being accepted by white America. However, I kind of somewhat disagree with the suggestions that America is moving towards a truly post-racial society, just because it's acknowledged that racial like inequality and privilege and categorization it still influences people today. And this honestly made me think about some of the trends that are happening right now. And one of which is being looks maxing and trying to look your best. And it's been growing within the male population and a lot of men. And so I found the reason why I'm talking about this is because it refers back to the idea of what is attractive. And for a main part of history, whiteness was very attractive. And so I feel that although I agree with the end of white America, where that section is kind of discussing that, I think almost now in society we're reverting back to being almost more racist, especially given just this time in history where things are super complicated, especially in America. I think, especially over social media, it has been more accepted to be racist versus maybe 5 years ago, even. So I don't think we're in a post-racial society, unfortunately. So that is the only thing I disagree with. And then finally, sports taboo. I agree that it's misleading to look at elite athletes and assume their abilities represent the entire ethnic group, especially because it explains that exceptional athletes are genetic outliers, who have different, even like from the most part, even in their own racial ethnic group. I also agree with the argument that stereotypes have real consequences, because believing in certain groups of people are talented while others need to put in that extra effort to succeed or have that confidence or willingness to pursue a specific activity. I think that the sports taboo um, portion of chapter 2 does a great job at describing that. And yeah, I don't really have much to add to that because even quote unquote positive stereotypes are still stereotypes. So yeah, I would say that kind of concludes all of my thoughts. And thank you so much, and goodbye.